So welcome back, everyone, to another Whiskey Wednesday with Vinny's Beverage Depot. I am Pat from the Whiskey Hotline, along with Brett and Joe, as usual. Our special guest today is newly minted Master Distiller at Jack Daniel's, Chris Fletcher. Chris, it's nice to have you on here. It's always good to take a little break from bourbon and talk about its southerly neighbor, I suppose. So you've been Master Distiller there for how long now?
I guess it's been about a month.
About a month. Probably a pretty busy month in a normal year. In a weird year, it's probably even busier, I imagine. We're selling a hell of a lot of Jack Daniels this year.
It's been a crazy year. It's been, obviously with what everybody's dealing with, with the pandemic, and my wife and I had our first child. We have a 4-month-old. We'll be 4 months old next week. So, and then the new job. It's been a heck of a year.
That's so I say you're getting a lot of sleep.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
It's just ripping all the Band-Aids off at once in one calendar year.
Right.
So everybody's joining us. If you got any questions for Chris, just please use the Q&A function down at the bottom of Zoom here, and we'll take care of it. Same thing, Facebook people, just type them in, and we'll try to get your questions answered. So, Chris, you want to give us a little background on? I know you've got some kind of family connection to the distillery, right? But I mean, I think when a lot of people think of Master's Distiller, they're thinking, the granddaddy's granddaddy was everybody was a distiller and stuff. But your name's not Jack or Daniel, so kind of how'd you end up in this role?
Yeah, well, it starts with my granddaddy. Just to tell you the truth. No, my grandfather was a distiller here. In fact, I'm in his old office right now. I'm in the main office of the distillery. It's dark out, so you can't tell, but it's just right over my shoulder there. And so I was around the distillery, at a young age, but my grandfather retired in 1989. And so, I was 8 years old, and, I didn't know, obviously the time that I spent with him here, I didn't know what whiskey was, or certainly what Jack Daniel's and the brand was. And so while, there is some of that family connection here, obviously I'm sitting here in his old office. There was never like any ambition or thought that I was going to be a distiller. Lynchburg, where we're at in Moore County, Tennessee, and we're the second smallest county in the state. And so as you can imagine, being the second smallest county in Tennessee, there's not a lot going on other than the distillery. And when you're, in high school and you're graduating and going off to college, I didn't really, moving back home to Lynchburg wasn't really the thing that I thought I wanted to do. And in fact, I was studying chemistry without much of a direction really of what I wanted to do with chemistry. I enjoyed it. It was challenging and I felt like I learned a lot. And so halfway through, after my sophomore year, I came home for the summer, and my parents, I kind of struck a deal. I was going to get a summer job, make some money. And I came down here and I took the distillery tour with my roommate, who wanted to come and see Jack and learn about whiskey. And it was just kind of a light bulb went off in my head about how great a job a tour guide is. You get to meet people from all over the world. They love Jack Daniels. You get paid to talk. I mean, it's a great job. And so I started working here. That was summer of 2001, and worked part-time, as I finished up school, and I'm a chemist, by education. And at that point I got really lucky because there was an opening with our company, but not in Lynchburg, actually up in Louisville, Kentucky, at the Brown-Forman headquarters there in our R&D lab. And so, I started working in R&D in June of 2003. And that's where, I had learned a lot from my grandfather, and did all the way up until, he passed back in January. And he was just a wealth of knowledge. I mean, the man made, during his time on the planet and running Jack Daniels, he made a lot of whiskey. And so he was certainly an influence, especially once I got old enough to understand and appreciate, and then kind of learn, the science behind the process. But really it was starting, in R&D, where in R&D, I worked on projects at our cooperages, in Mexico at our tequila distilleries, our Kentucky distilleries, tons of projects here at Jack Daniels. Obviously, it's the largest brand in our company. And so it was awesome. And that's kind of where it all started.
Were you doing distillation projects, wood projects? I mean, what kind of things Just kind of covering everything?
Any and everything. So I started working for another chemist. The very first projects that I worked on were cooperage focused. It was barrel extractions. And so what we were doing is basically taking barrels, new charred oak barrels from the cooperage, and grinding them up and then fractionating the different compounds that we could solubilize based on their solubility. And then that way we could separate, different forms of color and flavor that we were seeing extracted at extremely low levels into the whiskey. We could concentrate them then based on a different solvent. And then that would allow us to analyze those things even further and say, well, we believe that, I'm just going to make this up, right? Vanillin is coming from this degradation of the lignin or the hemicellulose at this temperature at whatever. So I started working on that, kind of quickly moved from there though into doing really more quality control, quality assurance focused projects with all the new make whiskey in our company. So at the time, we had some Canadian whiskeys, our Kentucky distilleries, all the Jack Daniel's stuff, and basically became kind of an extension of quality assurance. So every distillery, has their own quality department, certainly, but this group in R&D was able to maybe do a little more in-depth analysis or something. So if you were seeing, really small variations that, day to day really wouldn't make any difference, but if you started to see a trend over time, we could go back and maybe we could analyze the new make whiskey, go back and look at, incoming grain data, byproduct data, things like that. I ran our yeast lab in Louisville for about 3 years, sort of pretended to be a microbiologist. And so that was fun. Really, got to dive into fermentation and understand that a lot better for over those 3 years. Ended up managing a group that was really kind of in charge of tracking distillery quality output for all of our distilleries, working again very heavily with quality assurance, both from the benchtop chemistry work from the distillery, the grains, the byproducts, the sensory scores or the quality ratings that from tasting the whiskey that we would set for the company. And then also kind of managed over the microbiology portion for a little bit as well. So that was all in about 9 years there at BF. And, that's where I learned to taste whiskey really from a quality perspective, in the lab. So it was just a great place to start,
When you're tasting whiskey from a quality perspective, as you said, is that mostly new make then?
Yeah, at that time it was. One of the things that, it was actually a project that I worked on when I was in R&D was, I was able to dive in. If you look at that at the time, we had the Brown-Forman distillery, the Woodford Reserve distillery, Jack Daniel's. At the time, we had the Canadian Mist brand up in Canada. And so one of the things that, we really proved out was as long as when you put quality in the barrel, you're going to get quality out of the barrel, right? The barrel is not going to make good whiskey bad. We ran the statistics on that, and I guys, this has been a decade ago, so my memory is not going to be exactly right, but I don't know how many thousands of barrels we looked at that proved that out. 99.99% of the time, when the quality of the whiskey goes in, what we consider a perfect score is a 4.0. We use a 4.0 scale here, and so if it went in a 4.0, we knew 99% of the time it was coming out a 4.0. So the barrel is one of those things. I like to say, it's not going to necessarily make bad whiskey great, but it's not going to make good whiskey bad. And so, we kind of proved that out through that exercise. So we put a lot of emphasis. This is a long-winded answer to your question. A lot of emphasis on that new make, right? And so that the White Dog, new whiskey, whatever you want to call it, the consistency and the quality at that point is where we really want to make sure we're buttoned up, because we don't want to have to rely on the barrel to then overcome any shortcomings.
Right. Well, you have, and I think that a lot of people, we talk about this a lot, or we've talked about this a lot with master brewers, and home brewers shifting on to craft brewers, shifting on to guys that are working on macro breweries, and how difficult there's somehow the word craft gets removed and then it's a good thing to apply to a smaller producer, but craft gets removed from people that run a facility like a Jack Daniel's or a Brown Forman, which are, millions of gallons of proof spirit coming out of there every single year. And I think that people don't understand the craft behind making said millions of gallons very consistently, right? Because you can't, and you have a one day screw up is more than a typical craft producer might make in a year, right? You guys really can't afford that.
Yeah, you're right. We don't want one day screw up. We don't want 1 hour screw ups. To be honest, it's a great point, a great question. I get back to my grandfather, and my grandfather, there was no term master distiller when he was running our distillery, right? Head distiller, or just simply stiller, Stiller. I mean, I don't think he was master distiller until he had already retired. And so, really that term, I assume was started to be handed down, through really a marketing lens, if nothing else. But, we
Usually
never had
the
a
fault of the
master
marketing
distiller
department,
here really much. But kind of where I was going with that is, when you look at the process here, the grain bills, we're working 2 grain bills. The Tennessee whiskey is 80 corn, 12 malt, 8 rye. You got 70 rye, 12 malt, 18 corn for the rye whiskey. From that point, we are it's completely encompassed with our people, our employees, our mashing techniques, it's all natural malted barley enzyme to break down the starches to fermentables. We're not adding any kind of commercial available enzyme to get that saccharification. We're back culturing a yeast strain that was purified from that mother culture that, my granddad used to keep in the creek back in the day. We have a lab now where we keep it. We're creating a yeast mash to scale that up and souring that naturally with our own lactobacillus bacteria culture. These things, it's exactly what would have been done 150 years ago, just on a better scale and, not outsourcing anything. You look at our distillation, 100% copper column with 100% copper doubler, all the way through to making your own charcoal, making your own barrels. So, you can call it craft or not, if you want to talk about size and scale, absolutely. We're a big whiskey maker. But the beauty of our process is we don't outsource anything. We can control and do anything we want, do it completely in-house, and we have our own people and our own makers that can control it start to finish. So that's such an awesome thing coming into this role, to know that we have that type of talent here, to look to the future.
I think it's really cool that you kind of, got to see all those different areas that go into making that kind of self-sustaining whiskey brand before you kind of took on this mantle. In all that time, who would you consider to be the stranger coworkers, the microbiologists or the other chemists?
Oh, I got to say microbiologist as a chemist. Let's just say we're equally as odd. Let's just leave it at that.
So we had a question from Michael about what the typical formal education background is for somebody with a master distiller title. I've always been under the impression it's pretty chemistry heavy, right?
It was for me. My grandfather, when he started here, he was going to night school. So he grew up here in Lynchburg, and he was going to school at night for chemistry. He would come in the distillery at 4:30 in the morning, get off in the afternoon, drive to school, and then do it all over. And then, by the time you get to the late 50s, the allocation nightmare of Jack Daniel's No. 7 was in full force, right? Sinatra had adopted it as nectar of the gods, and here we go. And literally old No. 7 Jack Daniel's was allocated until it was like almost 1980.
Wow.
So, it's just crazy to think of that standard old No. 7 Jack was allocated for that many decades.
Yeah, now it's one of the biggest whiskeys on the planet, right?
Yeah, we were not. You got to remember, coming out of Prohibition, we were way behind our friends up north in Kentucky, right? So federally, Prohibition ends in 33. It doesn't end in Tennessee until 38. So we're 5 years behind. Plus, a lot of distillers had medicinal license, and we didn't have that either. So we started from zero in 1938, and so we we never thought we would catch, your big Kentucky brands. And in fact, I don't even think we passed a couple of them until the 1990s or so. But hey, we've made a lot of great friends. People love Jack Daniel's whiskeys, and we're really fortunate to have grown the way we have. And and right now, I mean, a rising tide lifts all ships, right? And American whiskey is, I think, more popular now than it's ever been.
Yeah, it's crazy. Absolutely crazy right now.
So how much, Jack Daniel's is sort of like, if you think of a really iconic brand for a lot of people, there's always just been one Jack Daniel's. It's sort of like what the way Maker's Mark was always portrayed. You talk to Bill Samuels about Maker's, it's like, I make one thing, I make Maker's Mark. There's one whiskey, that's it. Same age, same way. Jack Daniel's was pretty much like that for a long, long time. You had Jack Black and you had Jack Green. When did you guys start to play around a little bit? Because sometimes if your whole mission is to be consistent, I can see where it'd be very difficult to do things that would risk that consistency. So what was sort of the path for some of the innovations that have come along at Jack Daniel's?
That's great. A great question. So like with our Gentleman Jack, this was really the first one in 1988. But you can still see at the top here, Jack Daniel's. So I don't know if you can see it on my camera, but anyway, there it is. And so the one thing I would say is, when you look at the current state of American whiskey, for sure, I mean, there's hundreds and hundreds of bourbons out there, and most of them are coming out about 10 distilleries.
Yep.
So there's loads of brands. There's not a lot of whiskeys.
Yeah.
If you know what I'm saying. And so we have different expressions, but we only have one brand, and that's Jack Daniel's. And so the softer or more gentlemanly version of Jack Daniel's, the Gentleman Jack, which is a double mellow. I think you guys are having some of that for a taste. That was what we introduced in the late 80s when, the trend was clear spirits, white spirits. And so the second pass through the charcoal will actually strip a little of that color out, which of course is all from the wood, right? It's all brand new charred oak barrel. There's nothing, no additive or anything in there. And so by pulling a little bit of that color, a little bit really of the acidity from the barrel, some of the tannins that get in there, you are softening that mouthfeel for Gentleman Jack just to kind of smooth it up a little bit on the back end, especially.
And do you run that through a fresh bed, or do you run that through a bed that's had new make run through it?
It's not, it's a separate vat altogether. So it's not the same as if you've been here and seen kind of the really slow dripping through the vat of charcoal as new make, it's clear. Of course, that goes through goes in clear, comes out clear. Charcoal does not add, it actually removes. So obviously on the back end, it's going to remove again. It's not adding. This is carbon. This is not charred wood or toasted wood. This is completely combusted to coal. But on the back end, we're actually encasing this more in like a large filter housing, and we're pumping the whiskey through quickly, right? Because we don't want that. I mean, it can take 2 days sometimes for the new make whiskey to get through on the front end. We don't want to wait that long, and we don't want to strip that much color out of the Gentleman Jack on the back end. So it is pumped through in just a matter of minutes.
Interesting. So, but that's the thing that kind of separates it from all the other Jacks, right? Is it the only one that goes through the charcoal then on the back end, not just the front end?
Yeah, that one. And then we've also done that with our 27 Gold, which I think is a product that you have as well. Is that right?
Okay. Yeah.
Yep.
So the 27 Gold was double barreled and double mellowed. And so that's where, kind of the number 27 comes from, because it's double. I said, I thought double 7 was 14, but what do I know?
Well, do you do the double? Do you do the doubling? So you obviously you go into that follows, you're taking Jack Daniel's.
Yeah.
And then are you doing the filtering and then going into the maple cask, or
no,
you're going straight into the maple cask and then filter after that?
Well, I guess you have to consider the first mellowing or filtration is immediately after distillation.
Right.
So the whiskey is clear. So that always happens first. That's 10 feet of charcoal. And then it'll age at least 4 years. Then it's going to come out of those oak barrels after 4 years. It's going to go into a maple barrel for up to a year, 6 months to a year. We're going to sample as soon as the flavors from that maple barrel get in there. We're going to pull it because the maple leaks very, very bad, really aggressively. We will lose in 1 year in a maple barrel about what you lose in 4 years in an oak barrel.
Wow.
And
So,
what character do you get? What are the different characters that are coming out of Maplewood versus oak?
to me, it's all about the sweet brown spices, the brown, both aromatics and on the palate. You're going to get that brown sugar, butterscotch, molasses, almost like a melting caramel candy. And then also you really get this great creamy mouthfeel. So
it is a notably fuller bodied Jack to me.
It is, and it's still only 80 proof, which is amazing. I mean, it has the weight of much, much higher proof, but yet it is so soft and creamy. I mean, it's really an amazing product. So
here, are there different? So now here's for the chemistry, for the chemist in you, are there different chemicals in maple that are in play, or is it a different proportion of the same bait chemicals or substances that are in Quercus alba or in oak?
There are differences in it. The biggest one that I was kind of talking about, the leaking, is the tylosis that's not in maple, that's in oak. So the tylosis is what's going to help seal that oak up, and that's why 99% of the time you use an oak barrel. We use the maple barrel to get to that flavor. But yes, maple is, when you break it down chemically, maple is going to offer different structures, different things. Now, a lot of it is overlap as well, for sure, right? I mean, you still have, lignans and tannins and wood sugars that will overlap. But yeah, there is chemical differences between maple and oak for sure.
And then one of the questions, one of the questions was about the coopering. Is there a different method in which you're coopering the barrels in terms of toasting and char levels?
Yeah, so the maple barrels themselves are just heavily toasted. You could think of it as a really, really light char, I guess, but because our toasting is aggressive, we can heat that barrel up over 500 degrees, so we can almost get to combustion when we toast. But it is a separate process, and it's not meant to see open flame during the toast. So our standard oak barrel here, everyday fill barrel that we make, is going to get a 17-minute toast with about a 25-second char. So obviously a lot of toast, a fairly quick char, but that would be the equivalent if we were going to try to purchase a barrel on the market that would be roughly the equivalent char. It would be about a number 4. We don't use a number scale here. We have a specific amount of temperature and time and hold points that our operators are doing to make a Jack Daniel's barrel for Jack Daniel's at our cooperage. And so, we can tweak that as we want, as we need. But for the maple barrel, it is basically a toasted barrel. The standard oak barrel is both toasted and charred.
Okay, more questions on maple barrels, because this is fascinating. Jason asked, do you reuse the maple barrels, or are they one and done? And if once and done, what happens to them after dumping all the 27? And are they the same size as oak barrels? A lot of questions.
That one's kind of loaded. Yes, same size, 53 gallons. We've done loads of experiments with different kinds, sizes of barrels. 53 gallon is there's something magical about that ratio of surface area, the whole 9 yards. I've done big barrels, little barrels. Big barrels can work kind of okay. Small barrels, I've never had. I've tried them. It's just really, really difficult with that different level of extraction that you're going to get with the surface area change on an oak barrel. So just very different animal there. Not saying it can't be done. Just saying I've never been successful. We mostly always have once use. We have tried. We've done some second use just to see how much flavor we could extract, to see if once the barrel was soaked and wet, if that would help with how much whiskey we lose in that maple barrel. So we have done some second use, but that's it. But mostly all one use barrels. And I think right now, I don't even know how many maple barrels we have actually actively aging right now. Very, very few. So.
Very cool questions. you know, it's always Jack Daniels always kind of gets known as just like Brett mentioned earlier, the one thing. Oh, it's Jack Daniels, but there's more going on there in that distillery than I think a lot of people tend to give it credit for. You know, we were down there a year ago or something, Brett.
A little bit more than a year ago, yeah.
Yeah, and there's I don't know, you got all kinds of cool experiments and expressions and stuff. I wish we could see more of them up here sometimes.
We're working on that. Hopefully we'll have more to share later date.
Gary asks that as the new master distiller, what's your vision for the flavor profile of Jack Daniels, and do you anticipate making any changes? I'm sure the bosses at Brown-Forman would not like that, but I was going to kind of ask a similar thing. Like, if you got to describe Jack Daniels to a caveman or to somebody who's never had Jack Daniels before, what do you think when you think Jack Daniels?
Yeah, so, you know, basic flavor profile for me, look, I don't really overthink it. You know, I think we can talk differences. You know, you start rattling off 300 or 400 different things, man. You're blowing my mind. But on the nose, for me, I think the thing that jumps are the esters. You get that fruity character of Jack Daniels, apple peel, banana, green pear, apricot. Our yeast is very expressive in flavor. You know, I mentioned our yeast. It's grown fresh. It's in our lab right now, growing fresh. We're scaling it up by creating a yeast mash, a completely separate mash house that we dedicate 2 mash cookers to grow up a yeast mash of only barley and rye, no corn, because we're propagating our yeast. We're not fermenting this mash; it's for yeast growth. Souring that with our own lactobacillus cultures as well, and so that yeast is absolutely, I think, at the heartbeat of the DNA of Jack flavor on aroma and on the tongue. You know, you taste those sweet kind of fruit notes at the very tip as soon as it enters the palate. Now, as it comes through, you know, classic number 7 Jack, I would tell you it's sweet to oaky, not very spicy, not a huge finish, but balanced, right? So you've got a little sweet, you've got some nice oak, some caramel in the mid palate, and just a touch of spice on the back end. And so it's that balance of flavor in number 7 that it cannot change. It absolutely cannot change. That's not a good thing for me or anybody else here making our whiskey. However, you know, we have our single barrel expressions. We've got a rye whiskey that's really kind of created a unique following. You know, a lot of people don't even know we're making rye whiskey, and they're discovering it. And one of the most impactful notes of flavor, again, is our yeast and how it's expressing and creating on a 70% rye grain bill. That's quite a bit of rye. I mean, that's bringing some pungent rye. I mean, some earth, some spice, some pepper, and then when you get that nose and that fruit pops out of there again. I mean, it's just to have that tension of sweet and spice in a rye whiskey is really, really cool. And so I'm really excited about the future of rye as well down here.
And how much rye are you producing? And has that, you know, as rye has become a bigger part of the mix of American whiskey, has your production, at what level has your production mirrored that rise?
It's quite a bit smaller. You know, I wouldn't even know on a percentage basis, but, you know, we will only produce it every few months, basically.
Right.
You know, just because, you know, we're just now starting out. We've been pretty successful. You know, I'd say right now our rye is probably number 2 or number 3 in the U.S., somewhere in there on a volume basis. You know, so I think there's still loads of room for our rye whiskey. Right. And then when you look, you know, outside the U.S., around the world, I mean, just American whiskey in general is not as well known, you know, especially not rye whiskey. And so, you know, there's still a lot of room, I think, for our rye, but it's a fraction of what we're making.
Yeah, I remember the first time I ever went through Brown-Forman, the facility in Shively, the Brown-Forman distillery. Mm-hmm. We were there. We happened to be there early on in the year, and we were talking to the distiller about rye. And at the time, the bulk of the rye, I think, was actually being sold on contract to Heaven Hill for Rittenhouse. This is going back a long time ago. Mm-hmm. And he said there, and I thought about this, okay, this is one of the top selling ryes in the United States before the boom. And he didn't really have a percentage either. He just said, well, we make it 1 week of the year. It's like when we start up in January, we distill rye for a week, and that's all the rye we're going to make all year. And then we move about the rest of what we're going to make. And I thought, wow, and it seems like there was plenty of it around, right? And now all of a sudden that wouldn't be enough for that's probably not enough for just the Midwest.
Yeah,
If you only did it for a week a year.
It's amazing. People are, the American whiskey consumer is interested in learning and discovering new things, and both, with kind of a look back towards history, with brands like that, with Rittenhouse and things, but then also they want to experiment and try different things too, looking towards the future. So, I think, long story short, to be able to be a distiller right now, I mean, it's just, there's never been a better time. It's amazing.
Sure is. So speaking of distillers, I have a single barrel sample here, and this was just we went down into our little sample bank that Joe's sitting in, and I just pulled a random Jack single barrel that I found, which was a handpick of ours from I don't know when. And I noticed on the label it's got Jeff Arnett's signature on it, your predecessor. Have you been in a retail establishment or at a bar anywhere? I mean, I know things have been kind of shut down, but where you've seen have you had your signature on a bottle yet? And is that just the coolest feeling in the world, or is that something that you just kind of forget about?
Yeah, I think especially when the front label says Jack Daniel's and you can have your name on there too. I mean, that's an amazing thing. It's really special for me. I mean, because of my grandfather, for sure. I'm not gonna lie. I haven't really thought of it that way. I guess I've not, of course, number one, there's not any bars in Lynchburg. There's no bars or restaurants that can serve spirits here. And I have not been out, with COVID and everything. And, we have our young son now who's young. So we've not been doing a lot of socializing for multiple reasons in our house. But yeah, I think it'll be pretty cool the first time that I see my name on a bottle of Jack Daniel's. It'll be a moment that I'll stop and try to soak it in.
That's really cool.
That's cool. Back to some, now that we've embarrassed you, back to some and very humble back to some nerdy. There were a couple people still following in the String of the Wood, I think. One of them is there terroir for you in terms of the trees? Where do you guys try to source most of your where are you trying to source most of the wood for the barrels, both the oak and the maple?
Okay. So the maple is a little different. It's farther north, I know, but still, in the kind of probably Tennessee to northern Kentucky. I mean, you may get some a little bit farther north of that on the maple for those barrels. That, we don't source very much of that. So that one top of mind, I may have to go back and brush up on some notes on. Now for the oak, I can certainly tell you. So we operate 4 stave mills, are kind of around from kind of the edge of the Ozarks in West Tennessee that will cover Tennessee, even some out of North Mississippi and North Alabama. You can't get too far south because of the temperature and the weather. You don't get the cycles and the growth that you need to make a good barrel on oak. But it'll go farther north. We do have another stave mill in North Alabama in Stevenson. And then we also have one in Indiana and in Kentucky, which could source logs all the way up into the Appalachians. Ohio could even come over out of the Virginias as well. And so if you think about it on the oak side, anywhere from the Ozarks to the Appalachians is where we're going to pull from. And we're contracting with loggers. We don't have our own loggers, but we contract with them and they're going to bring us the logs. We're going to be looking for the lower part of the trunk. It's called the butt cut. So, basically before the branches is mostly what we're going to want to make a barrel. And so from that point on, once it hits our mill, we'll literally measure the log foot of oak. And from that point on, it's all controlled by our own people. They'll start debarking, the quarter sawing process. It'll layer dry for about 6 months is what we want on it. And then it'll be fed into our 2 cooperages. We have the Brown-Forman cooperage there in Louisville, Kentucky, which we still source a good number of our barrels out of that cooperage. And then we have the Jack Daniel's cooperage, which is about an hour from Lynchburg here in Trinity, Alabama. So.
Now, it's interesting that you mentioned that a quarter sawn. All those barrels, all those American oak trees, you're actually quarter sawing? I mean, that's something that you normally only see in French oak now.
Yeah, well, I mean, a couple of things. You want to, you want to get as much good stave lumber out of that log as you can. And then also the way that you cut those barrels are going to help to seal it up and block off the pores that are naturally in that oak wood, that were there at one time to move moisture back and forth through that tree. So there's a couple of things that you're trying to accomplish there with the quarter sawing. Yeah, it's really, I tell people, as cool as it is to visit a distillery and to learn about making whiskey, it's just as cool to watch our barrel makers make barrels. It's all done by hand. We have barrel raisers, that are literally raising everyday barrels, and so it's an amazing process. So maybe, hopefully, the next time you guys come down, maybe you can check out some barrel making too.
That'd be cool. So, I mean, kind of on the barrels, we talked earlier, you kind of have the two basic distillates. At what point when they're aging, do you decide, this lot is going to, be Gentleman Jack, or this one's going to go into the maple cast or anything like that? Do you have to taste these things in your market, or is it as simple as, we kind of like these warehouse floors kind of produce this mark of Jack Daniel's best?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, most of that, so when we go in and we're sampling for quality, once it hits that 4-year mark, and we decide to pull that out, we're going to dump, let's just say 1,000 barrels a day. That's going to go into multiple bulk whiskey tanks. And so, we might in a day, put so many 100 or 1,000 gallons in this tank, another 1,000 gallons in that tank, whatever. And so if we've put in 3 or 4 bulk tanks, X amount of whiskey, they'll go in after that shift, typically at night, and they'll sample each of them. And we're going to do, obviously we're going to taste that whiskey. We're going to look at the color of that whiskey, the aroma of that whiskey. And then that's where we can start build batches. So for something like, if you're going to rebarrel, for the gold label there. So, we're not going to want to take necessarily the darkest, oakiest, maybe more spicy whiskey, and then put it in that maple barrel to try to, give it those kind of soft, sweet notes that the maple gives. Nor would we take, a bunch of really dark whiskey and then take the color out of it with Gentleman Jack. So it just wouldn't make sense. So you're going to start typically with those kind of lighter expressions that most of the time are from lower floors in the barrel house. We don't cycle houses here. We're not heating them up or anything in the winter. So you get a nice, stratification of temperature from bottom to top, differences in temperature, airflow, humidity, which is really big on how the alcohol in the barrel will either concentrate or actually dilute. So, all of those things are taken into consideration, but most of it is managed, once we've put it into that bulk tank. Now, certainly single barrel products are completely different ball game because each barrel is its own batch, and things like that. But, a lot of it, we're managing it out of those tanks.
Interesting. There you go. What is what's your selection process? So basically you're starting out with Jack Daniel's, kind of. I mean, when you're doing these projects, it goes back to the core of, you're starting with Jack Daniel's. Before, one of our listeners said that they were enjoying a Sinatra and was wondering, I mean, you kind of done full proof. Were there any other experiments you might be doing with strength?
Yeah, we've got a lot of different stuff coming down the line. The only thing about whiskey and innovation is it takes years to get it there. But I can tell you a couple of things. Number one, moving forward, we're going to look at innovating start to finish in our process. We've partnered with our local farmer. We have one of our warehousing crew members. He and his dad are a local family farm here in Lynchburg. Last summer or summer before last, we grew 30 acres of an heirloom corn right here at the side of the distillery. We turned that into a couple hundred barrels of whiskey. I don't know what it's going to end up. It's only a year old, so I don't know where it's going to go or how it's going to turn out. But from that point at the very beginning of the process, we're experimenting and looking at different things, all the way through to the barrel itself. And what can we do to drive unique and interesting flavors into the barrel? We've we've done a product here the last couple of years through our single barrel special release line called Heritage Barrel. And that was a barrel that, I'm going to give Jeff Arnett all the credit in the world on this. He put away several years ago a really heavy toasted barrel with a very small char, just enough of a char to make sure that we were legally charring that barrel and keeping all that toasting intact. So if you think about it, you're really, if you think of it like kind of toasting a marshmallow or a piece of bread, you're just kind of browning and caramelizing, as many of those wood sugars as you can. And the char is really, you don't get any color or flavor from the char itself, right? The char is charcoal. Now the layer immediately behind the char, yes, that's where the goodies are at, right? And so the thought was to maximize that caramelized layer and just have a little bit of that char layer. And so that Heritage Barrel went on to be, really widely acclaimed. And so we're looking at, multiple things as far as toasting and charring and what we can do. We got a lot of projects going on. I would say, obviously, the trend in American whiskey out, and I think you guys would probably wholeheartedly agree, it's a broad brushstroke here, but people are interested in trying higher proofs, trying it right out of the barrel. We've got barrel strength out there. We're going to continue to innovate in that, elevated proof range. And then we're also seeing that people want to experience, more barrel character, more oak. How far can you push it? And so we're going to continue to push that as well. And so, all the way, like I say, from grain to barrel, we've got a lot of different things going on down here.
So how much of,
go ahead.
No, I was just curious on that barrel selection process. So that tells me that it's leading that we're just going to go out and start the rumor that you guys have a very old product coming, because that sounds like that's one direction it's going. What process do you go through? Because we do a pretty extensive amount of single barrels. It's been one of the cores of our program, and it's something that we've enjoyed doing over the years. What process do you go through to peel those barrels off that are going to be assigned to the single barrel program versus dumped into the vats you were talking about earlier?
Yeah, so single barrel, those barrels are all coming from targeted locations in barrel houses. And so, we know, and that's one of the cool things about, making whiskey here for 150 years. I can go back in our older barrel houses, especially, and I can look at our history there, and on each floor in each house, I can see, how much color we expect to be developed, how much evaporation we're going to expect to see, what the, quality scores and stuff that were coming out of there. And so that's a really powerful tool when you want to apply it towards innovation, or certainly apply it to single barrel. So, number one, if we're on a top floor of a warehouse that we know is a single barrel location, we are going to have our eyes on that for, instead of, starting to look at it around 4 years, we're going to let it go probably at least to 5 or longer. Because we're going to want to single barrel whiskeys, because you get that barrel to barrel variation, you're going to want it to spend a little more time in that barrel, because you want you guys, when you're coming down here, to experience those different flavors from barrel to barrel. And so that will be targeted, at 5 to 7 years, pretty much. It's somewhere in between there, depending on, again, without heating barrel houses, our summers, and how hot things are getting, evaporation rates, flavor and color development in those barrels. It's all going to go into the equation. But what we will do is if we've identified, hey, we've got a lot here, it's past 5 years old, we know it's in a potential single barrel location, we're going to go in and start sampling randomly through across the ricks and get a nice broad sample size and bring all that into the lab. And then we're going to sit down, and our master panel will come in and taste those barrels and approve it. And so once that is approved, and if we feel good about all of those barrels that we sample, we'll pull all those barrels out of the barrel house. And then, of course, each one will be lined up one at a time, as they go through to qualify as single barrel to get bottled as single barrel. So that's the only product where every single barrel is actually tasted, approved, one barrel at a time.
Just interesting, and follow up to that. So you mentioned, has the temperature, the ambient, has the temperature and the climate around the aging warehouse has changed, and how do you account for that in terms of age statement, location? I mean, how much work does it take for you to account for that as temperatures and atmosphere changes?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's one beauty of not having to hit a number for a statement. Single barrel whiskeys here, they're really no younger than 5. I've seen them be 8. I would tell you on the top floor of our barrel houses, once we get around that 8-year mark, I mean, every house is a little different. I mean, every barrel is a little different. But again, to paint that broad stroke, about 8 years for me on that top floor, we're really getting to the point to where the barrel is really starting to develop. Now that doesn't mean, barrels on the lower floor, you couldn't leave it in there longer. Sure, you could. It all depends. I would tell you for me though, and I love our single barrel select, to me, that is an absolute sweet spot for us. In that 5 to 7 year mark, 94 proof. I just think that product showcases, what we do, day to day. Our single barrel products are some of the best.
So, but you haven't had to adjust anything you're doing with the regular product, or it just is, or you're with the regular, or you just sort of, if you've adjusted it, I mean, I suppose if you adjusted, it would be so slow because you're trying to be so consistent that you were talking about, that if there eventually you wouldn't notice, there wouldn't be a sea change. If there were a change, it would take a long time for you to notice that all of a sudden you're pulling, at different times.
Talking like for the whiskey to keep up with like globally rising temperatures and whatnot.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Or regionally rising temperature. Yeah.
We haven't seen it affect our end product. I would tell you this past summer, fairly hot. The summer before that, really kind of wet, unusually kind of a wet summer.
Okay.
So, the past 2 summers have neither been real scorchers for us in Lynchburg. Now, a few years before that, we've had some brutal summers. But I over the years, I mean, again, like kind of like what you were saying, that's going to be, really small over time, and it is something we can track and we can monitor. But we haven't seen it affect the consistencies of our whiskeys.
Okay. Cool. That is, so you adjust for it constantly. I mean, basically what it means. You just adjust for it constantly.
Yeah, I guess with the goal of, putting a consistent product in the bottle, we will do what we need to do with, managing our barrel inventory to make sure it's consistent.
Yeah.
But we've not had to, say, oh, we can't dump these barrels based on the temperature last summer. That we've never had that situation happen.
Hey, so recently I read a press release, I guess, you guys, one of the experiments you did that was just for sale down there in a Jamaican allspice wood barrel. What kind of wood is allspice? Is that a tree, or is it really just a glorified bush? And was that really a lot more leaky than the oak barrels you normally work with? What kind of flavors came out of that?
So that wasn't a barrel manufacturer. That was an insert.
Okay.
And so those were, and basically you're right. So this, our R&D team in our Tennessee Taster series that we do is really a full-on experimental. I mean, and this with this Jamaican allspice, this really kind of pushed some interesting flavors in there. So this wood, basically a glorified bush, as you say, is what they use in the Caribbean for like smoking the jerk chicken. And so you really have this interesting kind of clove and kind of sweet spice tobacco-y note that goes along with it. And so one of the people up in our R&D department said, I got a sample of this wood from Jamaica, and I guess it's more commonly referred to as pimento wood.
Yeah, you hear pimento dram or allspice dram, is a liqueur that gets used for a lot of tiki drinks, and it's got a very
in Tennessee, when you say pimento, people think cheese.
Yeah,
that's what I think.
Rightfully so.
Right. So that's when we were like, well, first of all, right away, I mean, the wood is nice and aromatic. We did a really nice toast on it to really even, you know, draw more of those kind of sweet, spicy, a little bit of smoke out of the pimento wood. But right away we said, if we put pimento on the label, you know, people around here, because this product's only sold in Tennessee, it's very limited. We just don't make a lot of it because it's just experiments. We do a couple a year. So, you know, real quickly we decided, let's go with allspice on the label rather than pimento, because we don't want anybody thinking we're putting cheese in our whiskey.
Yeah, well, one, when we were in Lynchburg, we actually did do some pimento cheese exploration in the markets and different villages around, because we kind of do that when we go to Kentucky and Tennessee into the South. And on the other side, one of your Brown Forman sales folks named Terry in Chicago would really love to get her hands on one of those allspice bottles, in case she hasn't asked. Because she'd
Educational
like to
purposes
share
only,
it,
of
because
course.
she'd like to share it with she'd like to share it with some of her better customers. I think.
Okay. Well, I'll next time I see Terry, I'll hopefully make sure she can get her hands on one. But I hope she's going to make it down here to Lynchburg soon, because those, you know, they don't last very long. It's usually just a handful of barrels. I think we did 40 something, maybe 50 barrels of that. And that goes pretty quick.
She says, "Save me a bottle, Chris."
Okay.
All right, cool, man. What else? So, is there anything like that, like besides the allspice thing, is any one of these kind of experiments that you've seen in your time at the distillery that really stands out to you?
Yeah, there's a couple of them. You know, one of the first ones we did in that lineup was we called it like a high angel share. So the evaporation rate was really high. We were talking about it one day, a team of us, you know, that work on innovation here, about how, you know, some barrels, you know, we lose more than we think we're going to lose. And, you know, then what does that do with the whiskey that's left? And it purely coincidentally, I had been up in a barrel house right over here, and it was maybe a month beforehand, and I had sampled some barrels, and I found like 2 barrels that had just leaked completely, right? That it just, and that's really unusual to have a couple, you know, close together. You know, we typically don't see that. We will have casualty barrels that we lose, but it's usually a very, very small percentage. And so it was just, for whatever reason, you know, this group of barrels was really, really low yielding. And when that idea kind of got thrown out, I said, well, I know exactly where we can go to find some barrels. And so, you know, all of these barrels that we picked for that first production had evaporated well over 50%.
Wow.
I can't remember. I think it was,
And that's only 4 years. They evaporated over 50%.
It was older than 4 years. I think it was actually closer to 6 years. I don't remember the exact
Still
number.
not that old.
5 to 6. Yeah, it's not that old. It was top floor for us. But we bottled it at 107 proof. Thought about going full on barrel strength, but you know, I wanted to temper it just a little bit, but then still have enough in there at 107. So, you know, you could really get that kind of deep. I mean, and you got a lot of
I bet that was a
char.
dense whiskey.
Yeah, really dense. Exactly right. So that one was a big hit. We have another one that we've just announced that's going to be coming out in early 21 that we're calling a twin blend. And so I was looking through some production information. I don't know, it's been a while back, and I found a day where we actually entered in rye whiskey and Tennessee whiskey on the same day. So, you know, the same born on date, so to speak, right? And so we're, I talked to one of our quality control managers down in bottling, Jessica Hotline. I said, Jessica, what do you think about doing some blends? I want you to take the lead on this and see what you could come up with. And she did a bunch of blends and, you know, got some input from a lot of our tasters down there in quality control, and she just knocked it out of the park. And so we're going to have a blend of the 2 straight whiskeys, the Tennessee whiskey and the rye whiskey, and called twins because they were, you know, entered into the barrel on the same day. And so that will be one of the first ones coming out in calendar 21. So I'm really excited about that one too. Just to kind of get the feedback. I enjoy listening when you guys are trying these things, even our single barrels and these experimentals and these different whiskeys. You know, that's why we do it. You know, I mean, this is such a fun industry. It's such a social product. It brings people together, even though now it's all virtual, but still It's bringing people together. And so I love to hear what people are interested in. You know, to me, that's what it's all about.
That's cool, man. So, man, I'm looking forward to tasting that. Quick question on the rye. Does the rye go through the same regimen of the charcoal filtering as at the same times as the Tennessee whiskey does?
So it goes through much less. The thing about let's talk just for 5 minutes on charcoal mellowing, I think.
Totally.
And let's just talk about what it does and what it doesn't do. It's not an additive process. It's actually a removal process. We know, we don't have any chemical specification on it. Literally, we know when it's time to change charcoal when we taste the whiskey. If we taste a grainy corn note in our whiskey, it's time to change. So I said earlier, our Tennessee whiskey is 80% corn. So our new make spirit has a heavy, sweet, cooked corn note, very common in bourbon whiskey across the board. At varying levels, certainly. Nothing wrong with that. Absolutely not. It's certainly fine. It is not, some people say, well, charcoal mellowing takes out impurities. No, that's not an impurity. It's just not what you get when you have Jack Daniels. You get that fruity aroma that we talked about, those sweet cues, because the mellowing is absorbing a lot of the grainy character. So it's pulling out some acidity. We see the pH of the whiskey just go up slightly, a few tenths. There's a lot of natural organic acid made in fermentation. And so the charcoal will absorb a bit of that acid as well. There's where the term mellowing really comes in, because it's kind of softening the feel of the whiskey. So what it does not do, though, it does not change the overall fixed acids by a certain amount. It's not adding any type of flavor. It's not adding any smoky character to the whiskey at all. So it does not prevent our brand from being labeled as a bourbon whiskey, first of all. Tennessee whiskey is bourbon whiskey. It is, it qualifies.
Right.
We were nearly forced by the federal government in the 1940s to relabel our product as bourbon whiskey. If it hadn't been for Mr. Motlow that sent some samples into Washington, and I don't know what they did with them, but before and after mellowing, so they're both, clear.
What did he send with the samples? Did he have some bills strapped to the bottom of them?
I have no idea what it was. It was like 1943-ish. So well before my time. It does exist out there on the web. So if you're good with Google, you can probably find a copy of this letter. But it basically says, Mr. Motlow, you're right. We looked at these two samples. The flavor of the whiskey changed because of this process. You don't have to call it bourbon. And so, I think about that. And if you go back to 1943 and you think about such a small brand, we were so many big popular bourbons on the market. And first of all, I think, the Motlow family believed in their Uncle Jack's process and the product. Certainly. Absolutely. But if you think about the square bottle, the black label, different at every turn, and so they didn't want to just be another bourbon on the shelf, I think. And that's one of the reasons that I believe this is just Chris's hunch. Obviously, this is well before even my parents were around this place. But I believe a lot of it was driven of being a unique, a different style of whiskey, being proud of the whiskey that we make here in Tennessee. Mm-hmm. And so that's why they stuck to their guns on that mellowing. But it does not prevent us from being bourbon whiskey, actually. So we do qualify 100%. On the rye whiskey, to answer the original question, it does not go through the 10 feet like our Tennessee whiskey does. The big flavor that is removed is that corn, kind of sweet, oily, cooked corn, cream style corn, very common in young, bourbon whiskeys or corn whiskeys. You don't get that with Jack Daniels because of the mellowing. So if you remember, the rye whiskey is 70% rye, only 18% corn. So there's really no need to put it through 10 feet. So we actually push it through a small 3-foot vat, like what we do with our Gentleman Jack product, fairly similar to that on the back end, to where it's not a 2-day pass through 10 feet. It's more of a 2-minute pass through 3 feet being pumped through. We did want to soften it. We felt like, number one, if Jack were here today, he would probably insist. He had the reputation of changing charcoal very frequently, insisting on 10 feet. I mean, he was very much focused on the importance of what that charcoal process does, which is the way his family members took it after Prohibition, who taught my grandfather how to make whiskey in the way we still do it today. But it's not one size fits all. It doesn't necessarily work for our rye the same way it does for the Tennessee whiskey.
Yeah. Hey, Ron has asked twice now. Ron really wants us to talk about how much Jack Daniel's has grown in the last couple of decades. I don't know if Ron works for the Brown-Forman sales team or what, but it has grown quite a bit, Ron, right, Chris? I mean, you mentioned earlier it used to be on allocation, and now, and I see these industry rags on where it ranks in whiskey sales globally, but those lists are kind of skewed because some stuff that's really just like a sugar shine rum or something gets called whiskey in other countries that can't hear something like that.
Yeah, I mean, we've been so fortunate with the growth, and we're the number one American whiskey worldwide. I would still tell you though, globally, there's still loads of room for Jack Daniel's. A lot of countries in the world, anything brown spirits is just thought of as Scotch. It's just all, blended Scotch is just kind of the world's whiskey. And you think of the history of the Scotch industry. I mean, they certainly had a head start on all of us here in the U.S. You had the British Armada, conquering places all over the globe and taking their whiskey and seeding it all over. And so I think, that even though we've had some success, and yes, we're really fortunate. We continue to grow year on year, and I certainly hope it continues. I think there's still a lot of potential, especially as people learn about the process in all American whiskeys. And we should be proud of all of our great bourbon whiskeys and our great rye whiskeys and Tennessee whiskeys. And, we've got like over 30 distillers in the state of Tennessee now. So American whiskeys are really just now starting to get this global attention of, when you think about kind of the purity of what goes in. I mean, the only thing that adds flavor to these whiskeys is the grains, the yeast, and the barrel. That's it. And so when people realize that it's natural, and it comes from agriculture and this process that combines science and art so well. And then, I think the future of American whiskey is still, we've got a long way, many years of growth left for us.
Yeah, I agree. Tom Wisniewski asked, can you break down the mash bill on the rye again? He asked if there was any malt in the rye.
Yes, 12% malt in both of our grain bills. So the rye whiskey is 70% rye, 18% corn, 12% malted barley. Tennessee whiskey, 80% corn, 8% rye, 12% malted barley. So we only rely on this malted barley because of its enzyme content that will break down starches. So that's why we put the full 12% in both sides. I think
12% is kind of the tipping point where you then wouldn't have to add the lab grown enzyme, or however that works.
Yeah, I think 10% would probably, a lot of people use probably right around 10%. I can remember asking my grandfather that right when I was learning the process, and I said, why are we 12%? I mean, malted barley is it's a lot more expensive than corn, and it's considerably more expensive than rye as well. So there's incentive to put less malted barley in your, financially into your mix. And he didn't really have a great answer. I'll just tell you. He said, I'm not real sure, but I always assumed, in case whoever, was, back in his day, mash cookers were all completely done by hand and stirred by hand, and you didn't have good agitation or things like that at all. And if Bob or Tom or whoever took a smoke break and he stayed gone 5 minutes too long, instead of, clogging up a cooker and not being able to pump it out, I had an extra 2% malt to get in there to break down, all the starch so I could get it pumped out. And so that's what Papa said. That's about as good as I can do. But
the answer to that extra 2% is a smoke break. Then.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Maybe there you go. Maybe he's right. Maybe he was. I don't know. But, that is a true story. All joking aside, though, it is one of the things that we do hang our hat on here is how traditional our mashing process is. And the other thing is, we're completely open. There are no secrets at Jack Daniel's. There's nothing here proprietary, not one thing. You want to know anything about our process, start to finish, I want you to know. I think especially now with American whiskey, like we said, there's 350 brands and there's not 350 different whiskeys. So I think transparency is really, really important for sure. So I appreciate the questions.
I really appreciate something that struck me talking to you today was how much emphasis you personally put on the new make for the end flavor and quality in the whiskey. And it's like totally counterproductive to what I think a lot of marketing departments put on, where, you know, you're talking about how much the new make impacts the end flavor of the whiskey. And one of the first things you hear on any whiskey tour anywhere is, you know, 76% of our whiskey's flavor comes from the barrel. And then to hear actually to talk to somebody who actually makes it, they're like, no, really, it's made in the still house. I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, you know, it's a really great point, right? Because I mean, obviously, all the colors coming from the barrol, right? Mm-hmm. So it is critical. And let's say, look, over half the flavor, right? So yes, it is critical. But you know, to me, a distiller distills, right? And so, you know, that's really that's to be honest, in my background and in my career, my R&D days and other things that I've done, you know, I've been able to touch a lot of different areas and a lot of different processes, you know, but the distillery processes are really what I cut my teeth on and what I dove in on. So maybe that's part of it. But, you know, maybe the second thing of it is too, you know, we know every barrel that is coming out of our cooperages, you know, have the toast and the char, and they're doing their quality checks, and they're measuring how effective the toast is, right? They're measuring, you know, how long those char fires need to be. And we know the consistency, you know, maybe that, you know, it's just something that I won't say we take it for granted, but it's a benefit that we have to know. But there's a lot of truth, you know, into if you put good whiskey in, the barrel's not going to screw it up unless you've made a pretty doggone bad barrel. And so,
well, and you said, and alternately, the best barrel is not going to fix a bad whiskey.
Yes. Yeah.
So,
right.
I mean, I think that's the cap. A good barrel's not going to fix a poorly made whiskey. So we have, and this is sort of a technical. One of the questions is we're getting, which isn't really related to Jack Daniel's, but that was a question about light and storage of whiskey. And if you asked one of us on the hotline, we would just say, you know, the three great enemies of any sort of alcoholic products, wine, spirits, beer, whatever, are light, heat, and oxygen. And so if you can keep things, you know, in a relatively cool climate, doesn't have to be cold, but a cool climate, out of light, and not make it too hot, then that's the ideal storage. Right? Would you agree with that, Chris? That's sort
Absolutely.
of the ideal storage.
You're spot on. I would say, and with light too, like sunlight, UV light is even the worst. So yeah, don't leave your bottle of whiskey in the windowsill. I don't know anybody that does that, but if you do, get it.
You know, there's somebody that does. There's somebody out there that does.
Right, exactly.
So two whiskey adjacent questions, then we'll let you go. I don't want to keep you all night here. Jason asked if you put the number 7 in the ready to drink products, or is that just like an alcoholic seltzer type of thing? And are they canned in Lynchburg too?
No, they're not canned in Lynchburg. Those for the U.S. market are mostly canned in Louisville. We have the facility up there that can blend that and carbonate the things. We don't have a blending house in Lynchburg or anything like that. Yes, we are putting old number 7 whiskeys into those. You know, some of the other RTDs that you see over across in Australia, for instance, you know, really big market for the premix. We're actually tankering over number 7 whiskey as well, and it's being blended, carbonated, and canned over there. And so, yeah, that's what's going into those.
Various operations for Spike Lemonade.
Yeah.
Right.
And my other whiskey adjacent question is, Joe's favorite Jack is the Tennessee Honey, and he was wondering when he can expect Tennessee peanut butter.
Well, it's not the peanut butter, but the honey to accompany the bottle of the whiskey. That way I can have them both, you know, like I can do the Jack 7, a little honey. And then
you want to blend your own honey into it? Well, you can do that all the time.
Or you could do the Elvis collection as a co-pack and have the Jack peanut butter and the Jack banana.
Yes.
Well, you could.
That sounds great. That's,
you know, flavored whiskeys, I tell you, they're so popular. And the Tennessee Honey, that's our number 2 item, only behind Old Number 7.
Wow.
I mean,
Yeah,
it's
I'm sure,
amazing.
yeah.
And, you know, we resisted the flavored whiskey game for a while. We weren't sure about it. You know, and that's not something to be transparent. I don't formulate any of the liqueurs or those RTDs, either one. You know, I'm only involved with the whiskey production, the whiskey quality. But we have great flavor people. I mean, our honey whiskey is, I mean, it is rich. It has multiple layers of flavor to it. It has real Jack Daniels in it. Certainly that helps as well. But yeah, I mean, it just took off like crazy. And I've met people that say, I have the Tennessee honey with 1 cube of ice and a cigar after dinner, you know, and I've met people that mix it in vanilla milkshakes and make, you know, this, they call it like milk and honey or something. And so, you know, you just can't deny that people are loving flavored whiskeys. So
Yeah, we had to order a flavored whiskey sign for one of our stores the other day. So, I mean,
Yeah.
that's how you know it's kind of reached this critical mass at least on our end of the spectrum of it. So,
sure.
Well, Chris, really appreciate your time tonight, man. This is, I know it was kind of a broad ranging discussion here. So really, you know, nice to talk to a master distiller, even one who's fresh on the job there. Hopefully you're getting some sleep and can help navigate the rest of your year here. But, you know, appreciate it. And, you know, make sure Terry gets one of those Allspice bottles. So, you know, academic purposes, of course.
I see you sneak that back in. Okay, I won't forget. Terry, if you're listening, we're going to get you some Allspice.
All right, Chris, thanks a lot. Everybody else, thanks for joining us. The three of us on our side will be back next Wednesday. We've got some people from the Brookladdy Distillery in Scotland on to talk about all things smoky single malt. So until next week, cheers, everyone. And thank you again for joining us tonight, Chris.
Thanks, guys. Really enjoyed it. Take care.
Cheers. Be well.
Take care. Here, see you.